Okay, so today I'm here with Dr. Johnson of the Political Science Department. So, Dr. Johnson, tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Well, I'm a professor of political science here at Western, and this is my 30th year. And I teach in the areas of comparative politics with an emphasis on Africa and then the global South. And I also teach courses in American race, politics, and public policy.
Great. And what do you do? What do you like to do outside of Western?
What do I like to do? You want me to tell you the real truth, Hannah? Oh, actually, I volunteer with nonprofit organizations and community service organizations quite a bit over the years, usually in areas of social justice. And so that takes up a fair amount of my free time. And then I'm a sports fan, so I sit around and watch basketball or football, whatever's in season. That's a way to get kind of a release.
Great. Okay, so what does social justice mean to you?
Social justice, I mean, the movements that we call social justice movements are movements of various identity groups in this country and this world who historically have not been treated equally. And so I've come to be a supporter and a proponent of virtually all of those kinds of movements. And of course, for me as an African American, it started with racial justice. Well, justice for black people, and then when I moved to the Pacific Northwest, I began to see a larger landscape of race, of Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and so on. Already was grappling with women's equality, and later LGBTQ equality, and now the trans movement. Just justice along all of those lines. And what we find is that it makes you a better human being and really more human. And actually, there's human, which we all are, and then there's being humane, and that's my goal, in life.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How do you promote social justice in your daily life?
My daily life.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and of course you were in my class in South Africa, and over the years, your class was kind of extreme because it was 13 women and one guy, but actually the previous class was all women, and they've always been majority women. The good news for me was that I figured out in the 1990s that somehow or another, because I don't mind being close to students, as long as I handle myself well. I don't think I have anything to lose, and that was easiest when I first started. I was kind of young, and young males of color would gravitate toward me, and it would be easy for them to say, hey, why don't you come over to the apartment and watch a football game with us? We'll slug down a few beers, and that was all very easy to do. And then one of my female students saw me. Well, we were all standing on Red Square, and there was a couple of women and 3 or 4 guys, and the guys were and we were planning to get together, and then they walked on, and she said, how come you never invite us to go out with you guys? I said, I never thought about that, and so that took me down a road of, learning how to mentor female students without becoming a sleazebag, there have been some rough moments. I'm not going to pretend like I just said boom and then all of a sudden I was a great mentor for a female student. But by the time you and your classmates came to me, I have I kind of know how to do this. But that's a big thing because we're talking about half of the human race here, and so I mean I'm patting myself on the back, but it's been like a 20+ year effort. So that's, I forget what your question was, but that's a big way in which I feel like I've like, and I demonstrate that as hopefully as a role model just in my behavior, for of course students, take to it, but I mean for my colleagues too, that you can do this, and that we need to do it. So that's a big one, and then of course the LGBT stuff was a big one. And I will say that my work in the human rights movement beginning in the 1990s, which was work to support racial minorities and then religious minorities, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the some of that militia, anti-government militia stuff in the 90s. But then sexual, as we call them, minorities, because there's a lot of homophobia too. Gay people being attacked on the streets in the Pacific Northwest, that kind of thing, and so we attacked all those fronts. And I was a leader in the local group here, a spokesperson, this black man, and I got invited to gay rights events to speak. And I remember the first time I did it, and it was a room that was mostly people who were lesbian or gay, and the vast majority of them were actually lesbians. And I just, as I was standing up there, I just think, I said, wow, who would have thought me would be somebody who would be speaking to this group, say like 10, 15 years beforehand. But then, we became a very strong, gay rights advocate. So it's second nature now. So these are a couple areas, though. I feel I'm proud of myself for having done the personal work that.
And how do you promote social justice at Western specifically?
Well, I get asked to do a lot of stuff where I get an opportunity to speak specifically to the issues, whether it's to student groups, mostly student groups. I'm on the university's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, or Equity, Inclusion, and Diversity Task Force, which is now struggling to produce a strategic plan for the university before Dr. Shepard retires here, so in the next few weeks, right? Just have something for the new president that's on their plate as they walk in. So, this is, heavy lifting, going to committees and coming away with assignments and stuff you have to do. And I just yesterday completed my second training for the Human Resources Department on What's Up with White America, which is a faculty and staff training thing. And so I've done a couple of those, and there's plans for me to do more. And so, there haven't been any people. I mean, it's not that people of color couldn't come to it, but it's geared to a white audience, and they've all been white. And so that's just again, these are examples of some of the things that we do. And I just kind of think, hopefully every day, I try to treat everybody. Now, treating everybody equal doesn't mean you treat everybody the same, because you have to understand who you're dealing with. But I try to treat everybody equal. I really do. And I goof around in class, and you've seen it. And sometimes when you're trying to be funny, you might offend somebody. And I tell you, I say, throw something. Or come speak to me after class. And that's almost never happened. It has happened, though. You see, that was kind of not that cool. I said, oh, okay. So we try every day.
Yeah. And I would definitely say in your classes as well, you promote social justice a lot at Western, because I would argue that a lot of the people that take your race, politics, and public policy class, this is the first time they may be hearing these kinds of ideas. And for me, it's really interesting because we talk a lot about issues of race and policy in human services, but it's interesting to hear it from more of a political science side of it. So I would say for sure that within that class, and probably in other classes, I'm sure you mentioned these kinds of issues as well. You also promote a lot of social justice for different students.
Which, in academia is a little controversial because the academic, being a social scientist means that you're dealing with data and then some attempt to be sort of objective, and then we're supposed to kind of offer both sides or differing sides of stuff. I was really careful before I got tenure, and then I got tenure, but it's just even been more recently, about the last 5 or 6 years now. I just say, tell me what you think, Hannah. But actually, some of my older students, when I was struggling with technology years ago and PowerPoints and all that, one of my former students then said, you shouldn't worry about using technology. She said, you should be yourself in the classroom. And she said, people really benefit from that. And, by that time, I had everything, all my classes up on slides, basically. I still use the slides because I think they become a good study tool. And you don't have to worry about, although I still have review materials, but you don't have to worry about that as much because, just come to class, hopefully, so you take a few notes, but you got the slides. But, you see how I present now. So then it's not so much objective, it's really kind of what I think, right? So it's very subjective in that way. I'm sure it's biased. What I want to say is that the other side's points of view, I think, are available. And I think the way I make you write the paper in this class makes you have to talk about both sides and what their values are. And I don't judge those papers. And the last part of that paper will ask you what you really kind of think, And I don't take off for people who don't agree with me. So in that way, I think it's objective enough. But as I was just saying today, some of this material is stuff I know people have not been exposed to, even in an American history class. And a couple of times here already, I've said, what I'm telling you here today, I had a PhD and was already teaching this stuff before I knew it. So and just to let people know that it's stuff that they need to know to be good citizens, and the perspective that I'm trying to bring, which contains my biases, is something that young, I think, American students going into the world ought to be aware of if you're going to be a good citizen. So that's where I justify how I approach it.
Yeah. Well, and I really appreciate your perspective that you bring in a lot of the personal stories that you talk about, too. And I know you joke about how you're getting off track and how you don't know why you're telling these stories, but I think it's important to hear people's stories and hear why they are where they are. And I think that's valuable for the students.
Thank you.
For sure. Do you feel that Western does what it can to promote social justice for marginalized students on campus?
Well, I think, everything, my whole perspective on this changed when the whole hate crime thing, alleged hate crime, happened against our AS president last fall. It was at that point that I recognized that we haven't been doing enough. I would still say that Dr. Shepard has set us on a course in his, 8-9 years of presidency, and he's put certain things in place and started to move us. And it's not only diversity issues, it's internationalization. There's also an element of diversity, but it's sustainability, those kinds of things. I think that there are institutional things in place and in motion that, and there's campus buy-in, okay, that will be very hard for a new president to turn around. And the early prognosis about the new president is that he's not going to be somebody who wants to turn that around. In fact, maybe somebody who can take us to the next level. So what I will say about Shepard, and I think the way that I'll call it a hate crime was handled, certain aspects of it show his limitations, because I think he's and then he's an intellectual. He's a person who pays attention to what's going on in the world, and he is very clear about where the university needs to go. But he himself doesn't have the tools within himself. I mean, he doesn't have the social capital to do the stuff. I mean, the other thing about him is he's a delegator, which, I mean, when you get to those kind of lofty positions, it's smart. You're working smart if you know the right people, the talented people. You give them a job, they do it, and then they report back to you. You don't have to do everything. But I think when we're talking about diversity and equity and inclusion, you have to walk the talk. You have to role model it. You can't go to every student event or lecture or symposium that's on these issues, but you ought to show up to some of them every once in a while and be seen. You know, and because you know you have things to learn too. I mean, I told you I went to a I don't know if I went to the thing on trans identity workshop last spring. That it was a collaborative thing, a student and a couple of professors, and my jaw just hit the floor. I mean, I was taking notes. I've still got my notes from that session. You know, I learned so much. And but I mean, I think he hasn't been hands-on, and I think when I get some FaceTime with the new president, which will happen sometime, I will say to him that you need to be seen. You can't just say, yeah, this is the stuff we got to do. You got to be seen. And I'll also say there was aspects of how this whole thing with our AS president and safety issues with campus security and in the Bellingham police, it was not handled well. And ultimately that falls on his plate. And as a result, we have a group of young, mostly women of color, who are totally traumatized. And their whole life their education has certainly been changed. I think their life has been changed. In a way, I hope there's something productive that comes out of it in the end, but right now, it's just a really negative thing for them, and then it's rippled across the campus. And I think that lays on his plate, so, you know, it's unfortunate. I would still say, though, that I think he set us in the right direction, and he started to put some things in place that would be very hard to turn around, and that the next president can build off of it.
Yeah. So these issues that people of color and LGBTQ identifying people and women on college campuses are being faced all over the country. How do you see campus climate changing in higher education because of these issues?
Well, it's I called what happened here an earthquake, and I think there's been a series of them around the country, and the tremors, the aftershocks, what we're dealing with. It's such a big, massive thing that the real truth is, when you're talking about higher education across the country, you know, a lot of places aren't going to be able to pull it off, but some places will. And I hope that this is a campus that is able to make that transition into a completely inclusive environment. And it's a public institution, so it's a really hard thing because, you know, on one hand, somebody wants to come here and they're racist and they're misogynist and the rest of it, and they just want to be left alone and they want to study engineering technology. I mean, they should be able to come here and do that, but, you know, their behavior is still going to be, you know, in question. I mean, in other words, you can't just say anything. You can have attitudes, but your actions would be circumscribed by the campus environment that we're trying to create here, you know, that doesn't accept, you know, certain kinds of public display and behavior. But I think we can do it, and I think the argument is always that we're trying to prepare people for this century and the way that the world is changing. Um, yeah, and now what was the question exactly? 'Cause I want to make sure.
Just how you see campus climate changing over the next decade, couple of decades.
It's, Robin DeAngelo, I don't know if you got a chance to go listen to her. I think I'm gonna bring some of her stuff into our class. But when we had like a luncheon meeting with her, and there's only about 5 or 6 of us, she said, if you really, and of course her particular thing is race, but it just in your personnel practices, and I'm talking about staff as well as faculty. If somebody it's particularly crucial for faculty that they got to have some demonstration of their experience around diversity before we hire them. One of the tragedies, where this department is so diverse, it's like off the hook. I mean, how do we do it? I can tell the story about how it happened. Now, me and Salazar were here, 20-some years ago, and then there was a conscious move to hire women in the late 80s and early 90s. We gotta get some women on this faculty. And we hired Salazar, Paris, and Weir at the time. And that was 3 women out of like 12. And we stuck there forever. And then when the old boys started to retire, we had one white guy we hired who didn't get tenure. Then we hired Chen. So he was the best candidate, and we hired him. Then 2 years later, we were looking for a Betty's and Schwartz position at the same time. And of course, all the other candidates were white. So there were like 8 candidates, 2 positions. And in both of their cases, he went to UBC, she went to Johns Hopkins, which is absolutely the best place in this country to study political theory. And they'll never come. I think Western a lot of times says, "Oh, the people like that would never come here." But we always said, "Look, we're gonna offer the job to the best person, and if we don't have enough money or whatever, or something, and they'll turn us down and they'll go someplace else. But we at least have to offer it to them." Well, they both came. That was the moment that we started to be different, because me, Salazar, Chen, Betty, and Schwartz. That's 5 people of color out of what was then 13. So that's a significant chunk. And then I remember the next couple of hires we did, one of the people said, it was actually Cynthia Moore, it doesn't matter, so she told the story. Because we always, they give their job talk, and then we have a little reception at somebody's house, And, of course, the candidates are always exhausted. And Cynthia was sitting over in the corner by herself over at Kristen Paris' house. And Kristen ran over and said, "Are you okay?" Because the rest of us are drinking glasses of wine and having appetizers and stuff. We're just having a good time. And she said, "No." She said, "I was just looking at you guys and how you interact with each other. You really like each other. It's because academic departments aren't always that way." And, of course, the diversity of us, already at that time. But we never, the racial diversity was never consciously pursued, and that would never. Of course, you can't put things like that in job descriptions. You can say that we're an affirmative action employer in the old days, or an equal opportunity employer. You can still, but it's just we had the sensibilities about it, and when we saw people walk in the room, we said that's who we want, But you have to. Every department's not going to do that, and so you have to have something built into the system that says, well, something about the diversity of experience has to be in their resume, and then when they come in and interview and answer the questions, they have to show us something, or then we would say that they're not the right fit for us. So the next president hopefully will hear that message, and I think, it's also true for staff, because people working in offices interact with students, and our students are complaining about how diverse the campus is. But boy, I tell you, it's just the numbers look okay to me. I have to say that. I walk around, look around. There's just so much, to me, so much diversity here. I know the students can still feel like when they're sitting in classrooms and there's only one or two of a racial group, and you know, it still feels isolating. Um, and I think that if you have a professor who creates a more inclusive classroom environment, you can do some things to help with that. And so we have to have teachers, we have to have staff people who work in offices who are all, you know, more inclusive in their mentality as they deal with our clientele.
Mm-hmm.
So that has to be in job descriptions somehow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think part of what you just said answers this question, but I'm curious to hear what else you have to say. With a system like higher education that has internalized, institutionalized oppression and things like that, how do you begin to fight for underrepresented students and change the attitudes of people on campus and the policy that may be keeping them in the margins?
Well, you know, it's that's hard because especially as Americans, we got this idea that it's a free country and that people with all on it, they can believe whatever they want to believe. And of course, that's true because you can never really get inside anybody's head and make them change. So so you're trying to engage in persuasion all of the time, and to a large extent, that doesn't really work. You know, if somebody's really racist, if they're really homophobic, then you know none of that's gonna make them change. What you can say that there's certain codes of conduct that are acceptable and that are not. So that's what you can do. Now, you didn't use the word microaggressions. There was a term there that you used that's a popular term in this question.
Institutionalized oppression?
Institutionalized and then internalized oppression, all that kind of stuff. And then, so, now internalized oppression is like me as a black person, you know, lacking self-esteem because of all of the messages about black inferiority, for instance. So what do I do about that with my students? You know, I mean that's why everybody needs mentors. You know, so you have to have some kind of personal relationship with somebody who's a mentor to help you through that. And there aren't enough of us around. You know, people like me have tons of responsibility that way. And so that's why you have to diversify your staff and your faculty so that you can distribute that labor in the end. So that's a long-term project. And then I think you can do, in spite of what I said about, you know, it's really hard to really just change people. It's not impossible, and there are some people who do change faced with, you know, better information. This whole stuff about implicit bias now that's come up with all the police stuff, we're beginning to make some headway there because, you know, these are people, we're all biased, you know, and we all got these little scripts running in our head, and the best social psychology and everything shows that. Some people will be able to get that. I've heard of people who've been doing trainings like with police forces, and when you don't come in hitting them over the head with a hammer, but show them stuff about implicit bias, that they some of them begin to open up. It's never be everybody. The Dean of Students Office, Dean Pratt, has been very courageous the last 2 years because Robin DiAngelo is part of this series that he's been doing. Jess was in the Dean of Students unit, which is all the stuff in the VU, for instance, and he's been making his staff go through these trainings about equity and inclusion, and you know he got pushback in the beginning. And some people were threatening to kind of sue because they said, "Hey, you can't make me do this." But then it was ruled that when you're a supervisor and you want to do some in-service training stuff that you think it will make your staff more professional, you can do it. So I have a lot of respect. So things like that can be done, and I think that even though the classic white male who comes in and he's like this, which is typical. I'm not going to let any of this information get in. You know, if they sit there the whole time, you know, something will change. Then let me put it that way. Something has a chance to change. you know, unfortunately, it's the way it is. Things don't change much unless there's upheaval, unless there's crisis, because and then it's the war of position. It's not because you persuaded anybody morally. It's because now you've got, first of all, you've got enough juice, you've got enough power, and then you've made a statement, and which is backed up with like protest, and the people who are in power don't have wiggle room. You know, so it's not a matter whether they agree or disagree. They got to give up some of what has been institutionalized in order to return to some kind of a status quo. So it's a power struggle, and I think that, and then sometimes though when those public displays, protest politics, fortunately sometimes violence. See, and this is the lesson from the 1960s with white America. A lot of white people changed when they saw the outrage and the power, particularly the black movement, but also the Chicano movement, Native American. Those dramatic demonstrations of opposition to oppression. It clicks for people when they see that, and that's why that's an indispensable part of social justice and social change is people who are willing to put themselves out there because other people see it and they say, you know what, now I get it.
Yeah.
So it's working that institutional thing, and then when young people have had enough and they go out and protest, pay attention to that because things will change when things like that happen.
Yeah. Are there any groups here on campus or programs, departments, either on the academic side or on the student affairs side, that you'd want to give a shout out to that you think promote social justice on campus?
I think Woodring College, under Dean Francisco Rios and his associate Dean Karen Dade, I think they're exemplary, actually, because that's a big college and it is a very critical location because they're training our teachers. And we now know that 90% of our teachers are white, and the color of the classroom is changing in America, and we got two problems. How do we get more students of color to go into teaching? And then how do we train whoever goes into teaching to deal with the demographics that's coming in those classrooms? And I think Rios he's put a lot of things in place. He inherited a couple things and has made them bigger. I mean, the Center for Equity and Educational Equity and Diversity. I mean, that's why I put my books on reserve down there, because I make students have to go down there, because part of what has to happen is we have to get you students also leading less segregated lives. That's another thing, but just for the whole society. We lead segregated lives, and then so white people don't have the social capital, the social skills to take part in the change that needs to happen so much. But anyway, Rios they're doing. I mean, they have these. The Seed has something called Courageous Conversations that they do 3 or 4 times a year, and then they created this new education and social justice minor. That's a collaboration between Woodring and Fairhaven, and their minor immediately had 50 students in it. And Veronica Velez, who chairs it, and is overworked immediately. They have just agreed to create, and then plus they had a joint appointment between Fairhaven and Woodring. Next year there will be a second person who's faculty in that program, and there'll be a Fairhaven person, and she'll be in Woodring. I mean, she's pre-PhDs in education. But I mean, they then have been doing these teach-ins also, like once a quarter, and just these big sort of visible efforts. So I like what Woodring's doing. I would give them a shout. And you're a Woodring student.
I am.
At least half of you.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. So my last question is, what advice would you give students who want to fight for social justice as a person who's been very active in social rights issues your whole life and in higher education and everything?
So if you want to work for social justice, just start working for it, and find. And this is what I said in my training yesterday. That these come as much as what's up with white America, and you sit around and except for me, it's a bunch of white people, and people are lamenting, oh, it's so terrible, blah blah blah. I said, but what you gotta do is get in the mix. White people have to go into community organizations, nonprofits, where you're dealing with communities of color, or at least that's a significant part of the constituency that you deal with and the issues that are concerned for them, and then do that work. So it could be a job if you're fortunate enough as a human services major to work in, I don't know, migrant farm worker community stuff, or South Seattle, where you have large black and Asian populations with all kinds of social concerns, and then just being around those people and seeing it and hearing it from their perspective, and then rolling up your sleeves and becoming committed to working for social justice and racial justice. That's what people have to do. You can't. It's not enough to sit around and intellectualize and even read. We know what we know. The university's fabulous because we can enlarge our horizons through the book. But the other argument about knowing is experience, and I just think that people need to get those experiences firsthand, and then you got social capital that you can carry forward to change the world.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much for letting me interview you.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.